Good morning. So this morning, yet again this week, we have our gospel from the end of the Gospel of Matthew, and it corresponds with the end of Jesus's life. He's already arrived in Jerusalem, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem that we reenact in the beginning of Palm Sunday. He's already arrived with great falderall, and he's moving around, he's teaching, he's preaching, he's staying with friends, and very soon, the temple authorities are going to hatch a plot whereby they use one of his students to give him up. And they're just going to take him by force. And they're going to have false accusations against him and hand him over to the Romans. And he's going to be tried and killed. But before they resort to taking one of his students aside and seeing if they can actually bribe one of them, they try to catch him up in a series of questions. And they send their students and they send their best lawyers, and no one can catch him up. No one can make him say anything that could be considered a blasphemy against God. And instead, at least from the Gospel of Matthew, what we end up getting are some of Jesus's best teachings. And here where the lawyer asks him, and the lawyer is trying to trick him, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He gives him the greatest. Love God with everything you've got. Your heart, your soul, your mind, your veriness. That's the standard answer. And veriness is because there's a Hebrew word that's often used. Jesus doesn't use it here. But there's a Hebrew word that's often used that has no good English translation. But it's meant to be understood that if you love God with your heart and your mind and your soul, there might be something left over after heart and mind and soul. And so love God with your very self, your veriness, is to say, whatever else is left over, love God with that too. It's a holistic view. It's not reductionist. So we're looking at that. And in other Gospels, you get Jesus answering this question, but it's in a different circumstance. Which, might bring up questions like, well, when did he really answer it? Fair question. Did he answer it both times, both places, both situations? Or did the disciples know, yeah, he answered that question, but they put it in different people's mouths, depending on the kind of story they want to tell? Regardless, we're pretty sure Jesus said this. For your information, in the Gospel of Luke, for instance, it's in chapter 11, and it is not part of someone trying to test and trap Jesus. It's someone genuinely wanting to know. So here in the Gospel of Matthew, we're given the most important law, but then Jesus has such a quick caveat to that it's still part of his answer. He says, the most important law is to love God with everything you've got. And then he says, and the second is just like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we heard earlier in Leviticus, let's see, what is it? Leviticus 19, where there's a description of that law that God gives to Moses, and it's incredibly wordy, but then it's summarized at the bottom. You're given all the things you can and cannot do to your neighbor, but then it's summarized that you should love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, and what Jesus is doing here is one of my very favorite things. And if you've heard me preach for any length of time, you know that love God as yourself, love your neighbor as yourself, love God. These are my favorite topics. Jesus is equating your neighbor with God. Think about it. It's a logical statement. Love God is the same thing as love your neighbor and love yourself. So to truly love yourself, and this doesn't mean to spoil yourself at the expense of others, of course, because loving your neighbor is right there too. But to truly love yourself is somehow the same as to love God. And to truly love your neighbor in the same way that you love yourself is somehow fulfilling your obligation to love God. And it's more than just fulfilling an obligation to love God. It is loving God. Now, if we're in a happy place in a Zen state, that may not seem like a conundrum to us. That may be like, yeah, I get it. Right on. I am one with you, and you are one with me, and we are one together, and together we are one, and we are God, and it makes so much sense. Let's go have a beer. If we're in a happy place, that might make sense. But life is full of moments that are not happy. Life is full of moments that are difficult. And our difficulties seem to often come in the guise of someone else. We're not just having random ephemeral difficulties. We're having difficulties because of a person. Perhaps it's a spouse, or a parent, or a child, or a sibling. Perhaps it's someone a little further away. Perhaps it's a customer or an employer. Perhaps it's a coworker. Perhaps it's a client or a patient. Perhaps it's someone in authority. But we can often pin the tail on the donkey of our miseries, and the tail goes on a person. And yet here we have this instruction, this realization that the most important thing we can do in this world is to love God, and that also means loving our neighbor as ourselves. And in the happy moments, that is easy to hear. And in the more difficult moments, that can be utterly confounding. That can totally make our brains stop and say, are you kidding me? No, wait, stop. Are you actually kidding me? Because I can imagine loving a whole lot of people, but not that idiot. Jesus doesn't promise that this is always easy. That is never mentioned in any of the Gospels. Heck, it certainly wasn't mentioned in Leviticus. And in fact, in Leviticus, it was taken to be understood that this would be difficult. Do it anyway. Leviticus often took kind of a hard line like that. But as compassionate as Jesus is for the trials and tribulations that we go through as a matter of our normal life, he never promised that following him would be easy. He promised that it would be better. He promised that it would be a better life, but not that it would always be easy. And one of the perhaps most difficult things, and certainly it's one of the things that I struggle with as well, is remembering in the moment what I'm supposed to be thinking, how I'm supposed to be dealing with this. And, you know, the modern world has all kinds of ways to help us remember these things. We can put reminders on our phone. We can say mantras. We can do any kind of mindfulness training that you've ever heard of. Write it on a Post-it note. Stick it on the bathroom mirror. Remember to love your neighbor as yourself. Things like this. But you know, the modern world was not the first to come up with these ideas of needing to remember, needing to constantly remember difficult teachings. And the ancient Jews had many, many practices, physical practices, to help them constantly remember the most difficult teachings that they had. And if you've ever had the opportunity to be in a Jewish household, you may have seen one of these practices. There's a thing called a mezuzah, that's Hebrew, and it is it's a little canister. It's often made of wood, sometimes it's made of metal, sometimes it's decorated, sometimes it has words written on it. The words would naturally not be in English, they would be written in Hebrew. But it's a little canister that you affix to the doorways. And sometimes it's just to the main doorway coming in and out of the house. And in that little canister is a little sheet of paper. And the idea isn't that you take the sheet of paper in and out, but you know what's in there and you know what's written on it. And what's written on it is the first and greatest commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your veriness, with all of your strength. And it's written in Hebrew. And that is, in fact, the great prayer. They call it the Shema because that's the first word. And so you can find these little canisters, these little mezuzah, just affixed right about head level, maybe a little bit above eye level. And Orthodox Jews and some Reform Jews, and shall we say practicing Jews, as they walk in and out of the house, in their coming and in their going, they would reach up and touch it. They might kiss their fingers first to touch it and give it a kiss as a way to remind themselves what the first and greatest commandment is. And you'd think, well, if they're really religious, how would they have trouble remembering that? But it's not just remembering a commandment. It's remembering all the tiny, tiny ways it applies to your life. Sorry, I'm hitting my microphone. All the tiny, tiny ways it's applying to your life. And so, for me, it's not difficult to remember to love my neighbor as myself. That idea, that statement. I don't actually need it plastered everywhere at this point. I've been practicing it for a number of decades, mind you. But to remember to apply it in every situation where I could and I'm not applying it, man, I could write it on my hand every day. I could tattoo it backwards on my forehead so that I could see it in every camera and every mirror, every reflective surface. And I still would not be reminded enough to love. And the twin sibling of love, the other side of love, is forgive. So the question today is, what do you want to remember? Maybe it's love your neighbor as yourself. Maybe it's some other thing that you're trying to write on your heart. What are you trying to remember? And how are you going about remembering it? Amen.